literally the word koan. Koan should be translated case. The koans are based on stories, mondo, of the conversations between the old masters and their students. But you can make a koan immediately by such a question: why is my hand so much like the Buddha's hand? Or, who are you that asked this question? If the student tries to verbalize on that and say, well, I am so-and-so, he asks, who knows that you're so-and-so? How do you know that you know? Who knows that you know? Find out. In other words, the basic koan is always, who are you? Who is it that wants to escape from birth and death? And I won't take words for an answer. I want to see you. And all you're showing me at the moment is your mask. So then the student is sent back to the monk's quarters, the Sodo. And the chief of the Sodo is called the Jikititsu, is then put in charge of him. And he teaches him how to behave, what the rules are, how to eat, and how to meditate. In the Zen sect, they sit on padded cushion about the thickness of the San Francisco telephone directory, which is an admirable substitute. And then, with crossed legs in the lotus posture, with the feet resting on the thighs, like you always see a Buddha, they sit for half-hour periods. That's supposed to be the length of time it takes for a stick of incense to burn. And then, when wooden clappers are knocked together, they all get up and they walk round and round the room quite fast, at a kind of bump pace. And this keeps you awake. Then, at a given signal, they go back and meditate again. And constantly there is a monk, one on each side, carries a long, flat stick shaped almost like this fan, in the sense that it's thin at one end and rounded at the other. And if this guy sees a monk who's slouching or sleeping or goofing off in some way, he very respectfully bows before him, and the monk rests his head on his knees, and this fellow takes the stick and hits him vigorously on the shoulders, here, like this. Now, most apologists for Zen say, this is not punishment, it's simply to keep you awake. Don't you believe it? I've investigated this. And it's the same as the sort of British boys' school, only it doesn't have the erotic qualities that the British floggings do. Zen people are cool about it. But it is a kind of a fierce thing.
What's up, Pointless?
Anyway, the point of the meditation, the Zazen, is that perhaps at the beginning one does nothing more than count your breathing. So many breaths in counting in tens. Just to allow your thoughts to become still. Zen people do not close their eyes when they meditate, nor do they close their ears. They keep their eyes on the floor in front of them, and they don't try to force away any sounds that are going on, or any smell, or any sensation whatever. Only they don't think about it.
See, I put some
and this can
tags
become
in the title today.
An extraordinarily pleasant occupation. All the little sounds of distant traffic, of birds, of somebody carpentering somewhere, and a hammer going, dog barking.
Oh, really? Well, that is good. Anatomy is necessary.
On the roof. God. They
How
don't
about
block that
now?
out. But as time goes on, instead of counting breathing, they devote themselves to the koan problem.
I'm not sure if
the
that's
Roshi
any better for my
side.
microphone. Let's try
What is the sound
down
of one hand?
a little bit like that, maybe?
Who were you before
How's
your
it now?
father and mother conceived you? When Joshu was asked, does a dog have
I gotta
birth
go cruise
control,
around on
he
Twitch more
replied,
often.
no.
Better? Okay, cool.
What is the meaning of no? All sorts of these problems. And so as time goes on, every day the student goes to the teacher for what is called Sanzen. Sanzen means studying Zen. And he has to present a satisfactory answer to the koan. Now, Sanzen is the moment in the monastery when no holds are barred, although there's a very formal approach to it. The monk has to stop outside the master's quarters and make this mokugyo. He does that 3 times. And at a signal from the master, which is ringing a bell in reply, he goes in and sits down in front of the master and bows right down to the floor, and then sits up, and he repeats the koan that he's been given, and he's supposed to answer it. Now the master, if he's not satisfied with the answer, may simply ring his bell, which means interview over, nothing doing. Or if he's still not satisfied, he may try to do something to hint the student as to which way to go, or puzzle him further, some sort of comment. But what happens is this. Do you see what kind of a situation has been set up here? The student is really being asked to be absolutely genuine. So if I said to you, now don't be self-conscious. I want you to be perfectly sincere. And as a matter of fact, I'm a mind reader. And I know whether you're being sincere or not. I can see right down to that last little wiggly guzzle in the back of your mind. And if you think I
Landscapes.
can, you see, I'm putting you in a double bind.
Are you streaming this?
I'm commanding you.
Should absolutely be streaming this. Ooh, I
Begin.
like that ink.
How can you possibly do that? On command. Especially when the person you're confronted with
I've given
is
you a
father
follow,
figure,
my good man.
an authority figure. And in Japan, the sensei, the teacher, is even a more authoritative figure than one's father, which is saying a lot. But you are being asked in the presence of this tiger to be completely spontaneous. Or it isn't put in that way, you see, though. I mean, I'm describing this from the standpoint of a psychologist observing what's going on here.
Hell
No, the
yeah.
thing you've got to do is
More
you've got to hear
creative
the sound of one hand.
streams.
And as your answers become more and more rejected, you get more and more desperate.
Well, if it's
There
not
is
too
no
late, I will
doubt that
absolutely
state
pop in
that
on
is
you.
called
I go to
the
bed
great doubt.
pretty early, but
The students do everything, you know. They've read all the old Zen stories, and they come in with pieces of rock and wood, and they try and hit the teacher. They do everything they get, and nothing will do. I remember I had a friend studying in Kyoto, and on the way to the master's quarters, who passed through a lovely garden with a pool, and he saw a bullfrog in the garden, and he grabbed this bullfrog. They're very tame in Japan. Nobody put it in the sleeve of his kimono. And when he got in to give an answer to his koan, he produced the bullfrog. And the master shook his head and said, too intellectual. Of course, he meant not so much what we mean by intellectual, but too contrived, too premeditated. You know, you're just copying other people's Zen antics, and that's something you just can't get away with. Well, there does come a critical point of total desperation. And when the student reaches that point, the teacher really starts encouraging him. He says, now, come on, you're getting warm, but you must die, be ready to die for this. You must, students have even been put under into the position that if they don't get it in so many days, they're going to commit suicide. And they have, to stimulate this intense period, a thing called ossession. Don't confuse the word session with the English session. Session means studying or observation of the shin, the heart, the mind, the heart-mind. And at this time, they only sleep 4 hours a night. And they meditate solidly all through the day. They go for the Sanzen interview twice a day, every one of them. And it's a tremendous workout.
That's an answer, or that's a question of two answers. If your goal is to become good at eyeballing perspective, and stylizing perspective, then no. Like if you just want to stylize it and not really be accurate at it, that's fine. But it's nigh impossible to become accurate at it without a ruler. So I'm not going to say like, no, you'll never be able to get it if you don't use a ruler, because everyone's different. Like you could be like one of 10 people in the world that can do perspective perfectly without a ruler. Like Kim Jong-gi. He can do 3-point perspective, 4-point perspective, a whole tons of things without a ruler. So if you practice at it enough, and it might take a little while, but you could possibly do it. But if you want to nail it right off the bat, then a ruler's kind of necessary. That's why my interiors look so bad.
Is really on. Everybody is worked into a pitch of a kind of psychic fury that they have to get this thing answered. There's a man in Japan today who has the 5-day Zen system, and he practically guarantees that you will have Satori in his 5 days. I've just got a book about it written by a British. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Well, I had someone I knew of who was over studying Zen on a Fulbright grant, and the grant was winding up, and he still hadn't got the sound of one hand. He said to the master, look, the grant's running out and I can't stay here, and I've just got to get this thing. So just the day before he left, he suddenly realized that there was nothing to realize. And that was it. You know, here he had spent his whole life thinking that there's something deficient in me. See, there's something wrong. Something I ought to find out to get
to stylize it. And over time you'll be able to eyeball it in the way that you like seeing it.
Rinzai, the old Chinese master, said, Zen teaching is like using an empty fist to deceive a child. Or like trying to stop a child crying by giving it a yellow leaf. See, the child wants gold. And so you give it an autumn leaf and say, dear darling, there's some gold. Be all right. Or with your closed fist, you say, what have I got here? The child comes and tries to see and pull your fingers open, then you hide it behind your back and under your leg and behind the chair.
Most of your digital work isn't colored in or anything because straight lines are too neat. I don't think I quite understand.
It's absolutely fascinated. The longer you keep this up, the more the child is sure there's something real goody inside the hand. And then at the end, nothing. And that's Zen. So there comes the time.
That's what I've been doing, but I need a bigger tablet. I was just wondering, doing long lines. Hey, Astrid, what's up? Yeah, it is hard to get long straight lines with a small tablet unless you're zoomed out really, really far. So, like, with the size of my tablet, I can pretty much get a line this big, but if I was trying to fill a line with the whole paper, I'd have to scale out to about this right here and do it that way.
Can go in front of the master and not give a damn, because he's seen the point. There wasn't a problem. He made up the problem himself. He came and projected it on this master, who knew how to handle that kind of person, by making him much more stupid than he was before.
Just guilding new guild members, excellent. Practice 1 and 2 point perception for a lot.
Where we are playing a game of one-upmanship on other people and on the universe. How to get the better of life.
I'm not sure what toroidal and waveforms are, but it sounds exciting, because new things are always exciting. Yeah, I'm not sure what those are either.
Well, what makes you think you're separate from life so that you can get the better of it? How can you beat the game? What game? Or who will beat it? This illusion of beating the game, of finding the thing out, of catching it by the tail, is therefore dissipated by the technique of the koan. It's called, working on a koan is like a mosquito biting an iron bull. It's the nature of the mosquito to bite. It's the nature of an iron bull to be unbitten. Or they say it's like swallowing a ball of molten lead. You can't swallow it down. You can't cough it up. You can't get rid of this thing. That's the great doubt, you see. But this is an exaggerated form of what everybody is ordinarily trying to do, to beat the game. So at that moment, the student has heard the sound of one hand, or discovered who he was before father and mother conceived him, or what no means. So the teacher says, good. Now, you have found the frontier gate to Zen. You've put your foot in at the door, and you're across the threshold. But there's a long way to go. And now you have found this priceless thing out, you must redouble your efforts. So he gives him another koan. Now the student may be able to answer that one instantly, because it's simply a test koan. See, there are 5 classes of koans. The first class is what you call the Hinayana koans, and the other 4 are the Mahayana koans. Hinayana is to reach nirvana. Mahayana is to come back and bring nirvana into the world as a bodhisattva. So once you get the great void, you see, there's nothing to catch on to. You are the universe. It doesn't matter whether you live or die. That's nirvana. All clinging to life, everything like that, you see then that it's hopeless. And you give it up, not because you think you ought to give it up, because you know there is no way of catching it. There's nothing to catch hold of. There's no safety in the cosmos. So you just have to give up. Then, the next class of koans are such things as asking for miracles. In that class comes, take the 4 divisions of Tokyo out of your sleeve, or stop the booming of a distant bell, blow out a candle in Timbuktu. But as they go on in various ways, they are concerned with all kinds of problems and how Zen understanding deals with those problems. until we get in the end to the study of morality and rules of social and monastic life. That's the last thing, and the Zen way of understanding it. Now, this takes very, very differing periods of time. Some people get through in as little as 10 years, the whole thing. There is a very brilliant Westerner by the name of Walter Novick, who has just about completed the whole thing. And he's a musician and a pianist. And he'll come back to this country as the first accredited Zen master of the West. And he'll set up his little sodo on a farm and wait and see what happens. The day of graduation comes, and then everybody turns out and there's a great hullabaloo, and they salute the departing monk, and he goes out. He may just become a layman, as I said, or become a temple priest, or he may be himself a Roshi. Well now, the essential of this whole system, as you see, is to use a hair of the dog that bit you for the cure of the bite. It's homeopathic. When people are under delusion, they cannot be talked out of the delusion. No amount of talk could persuade anybody that his ego is an illusion. Because he knows it's there. He knows I am I. And simply won't believe you if you tell him that this is nothing but post-hypnotic suggestion. So the only way to convince a fool of his folly is to make him persist in it. As Blake says, the fool who persists in his folly will become wise. By some psychiatrists I know when they get a person who overeats and is tremendously fat, the first thing they do is they make them put on 15 more pounds. And get an alcoholic terribly drunk. Oh, and sick and just as awful as could be, you see. Really make him go at it. That's the method that's used. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. It's a rather desperate method. Rather dangerous method. Zen is dangerous too. People could easily go crazy under this sort of strain without a good advisor. Well, it is clear, of course, that this method of Zen training is most unsuited to the modern age. And this is witnessed too by the fact that the temples are relatively empty. Myoshinji, the biggest one in Kyoto, is built to house 600 monks. There are only 80. And you might think that was quite a crowd, but it isn't compared with the old days. To young people in Japan today, this is all incomprehensible. They see no point in it. A few, yes, but they are mostly clergy sons carrying out the family tradition. And that's very bad indeed. To be sent to a monastery virtually. It's as though the only possible success can come for someone who goes because he feels that nothing else in the world will satisfy him. He just has to do it. And so the traditions, as in all these ancient organizations, have become very fixed. A lot of it meaningless. It is certainly not going to last. Not in that form. It's falling apart right under our eyes. It's old and it's set in its ways. Also, since the time of Hakuin, the koans have been given fixed answers. That is to say, there is a sort of prescribed way in which to answer, and you've got to hit on the right one. And then after you've answered it, you have to find a poem from a little book called the Zenrin Kushu, which means the Zen Forest Anthology. And there are little couplets, and you've got to find one which represents the meaning of your koan. I mean, you know, take the 4 divisions of Tokyo out of your sleeve. Nothing could be simpler. But some monk has recently threatened to publish all the answers to the koans, so that the masters would have to get on their toes and invent new ones. I know a Roshi who invents new ones. And the moment they open their mouths, he stops them. No, no, no! Too late. You know, he says, you could ask this Christian, what's the first word in the Bible? And things like that. It becomes much more lively, you see, when there is this quick interchange of the teacher and the students, but in modern idiom. Who the devil wants to know about Joshu's Moo anymore, or some ancient fellow's questions, couched in language, incidentally. This is part of the problems they have. The language of these koans is very archaic. I mean, what is the sound of one hand? Well, there's a Chinese proverb which says, one hand won't make a clap. So if you don't know that proverb, if that proverb is in everyday use, and I say to you, what is the sound of one hand? Then it has some sense. But there are all kinds of, shall I say, references, allusions in the old stories, and they therefore don't necessarily fit our world or the Japanese world today. You have to take the koans out of everyday life, things that are going on now. And it's like asking, what's that man who advertises Schweppes, Commander Whitehead? Why has Commander Whitehead no beard? There was, though, you see, there was a division in the history of Zen. There was a critical point in the 17th century when there were 2 very great masters, Hakuin and Bankei. Now, the 17th century is tremendously important in Japanese history because that was a time of what you might call the democratization of culture. Basho invented haiku poetry so that everyone could be a poet. Not necessarily for publication, but for one's own fun. People didn't write poems for publication necessarily. They wrote poems for parties. And he invented the 17-syllable haiku as a result of his Zen feeling for nature, so that he could put this within the reach of everybody. What had happened to poetry before that time was that it had become so obscure and so effete and so sophisticated that only great literati could do it at all. This happened to Chinese poetry. There were so many references to other poems. It was like reading T.S. Eliot. You know, the 4 quartets. You could get an annotated 4 quartets showing you the sources of all the phrases he's borrowed. And sometimes you have to know the source in order to see what he means by it. And all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. All right, that's straight from the Revelations of the Divine Love by Dame Julia McNorwich. But whoever would know that? And you have to understand the scene she was digging in order to know really what Eliot's getting at in that all shall be well. And he's full of that. He quotes the Bhagavad Gita. He quotes everybody. So if we all had to write that way, nobody could be a poet, unless he was a great scholar. So Basho popularized the haiku. And the haiku are originally based on the Zenrin poems. They take their flavor from that. There is one, you see, that bird calls, mountain changes to be more mysterious. The first line of that says, the wind drops, but the flowers keep on falling. the bird calls and the mountain becomes more mysterious. And so haiku developed from that kind of short insight, that glimpse of nature. Now, while Basho was taking poetry to the peasants, Bankei was taking Zen to them as well, to the farmers. And he ran his Zen on an entirely different system. He talked mainly about what he called Husho. Husho is the unborn, that which has not yet arisen and which, as a matter of fact, never does arise. And so he said, there is in you the unborn mind which was given to you by your parents. Let me just read you a few quotations from him to show you what sort of a person he was. The mind begotten by and given to each of us by our parents is none other than the Buddha mind, birthless and immaculate, sufficient to manage all that life throws upon us. A proof. Suppose at this very instant, while you face me listening, a crow caws and a sparrow twitters somewhere behind you. Without any intention on your part to distinguish between these sounds, you hear each distinctly. In doing so, you are hearing with the birthless mind, which is yours for all eternity. Well, we are to be in this mind from now on, and our sect will be known as the Buddha Mind Sect. To consider my example of a moment ago once again, if any of you feel you heard the crow and the sparrow intentionally, you are deluding yourselves. For you are listening to me, not to what goes on behind you. In spite of this, there are moments when you hear such sounds distinctly, when you hear with the Buddha mind of non-birth. Nobody here can deny this. All of you are living Buddhas because the birthless mind which each possesses is the beginning and the basis of all. Now, if the Buddha mind is birthless, it is necessarily immortal, for how can what has never been born perish? You've all encountered the phrase birthless and imperishable in the sutras, not born, not dying, you know? But hitherto you've not had the slightest proof of its truth. Indeed, I suppose, like most people, you've memorized this phrase while being ignorant of the fact of birthlessness. When I was 25, I realized that non-birth is all sufficient to life, and since then, for 40 years, I've been proving it to people just like you. I was the first to preach this greatest truth of life. I ask, have any of you priests heard anybody else teach this truth before me? Of course not. A priest said to him,
how'd you mess up, Astrid?
once in the Buddha mind, I'm absent-minded. Bankei says, well, suppose you're absent-minded as you say. If someone pricked you in the back with a gimlet, would you feel the pain? Naturally. Then you are not absent-minded. Feeling the pain, your mind would show itself to be alert. A layman says, though I undertake Zen discipline, I often find myself lazy, weary of the whole thing, unable to advance. And he replies, once in the Buddha mind, there's no need to advance, nor is it possible to recede. Once in birthlessness, to attempt to advance is to have receded from the state of non-birth. A man secure in that state need not bother himself with such things. He's above them. The Buddha mind in each of you is immaculate. All you've done is reflected in it. But if you bother about one such reflection, you're certain to go astray. Your thoughts don't lie deep enough. They rise from the shallows of your mind. Remember that all you see and hear is reflected in the Buddha mind and influenced by what was previously seen and heard. Needless to say,
you deleted one of your characters? Oh no.
So if you permit them to rise, reflect themselves, or cease altogether as they are prone to do, and if you don't worry about them, you'll never go astray. In this way, let 100, nay 1,000 thoughts arise, and it's as if not one has arisen. You will remain undisturbed. The only thing I tell my people is to stay in the Buddha mind. There are no regulations, no formal discipline. Nevertheless, they have agreed among themselves to sit in Zen for a period of 2 incense sticks daily. All right, let them. But they should well understand that the birthless Buddha mind has absolutely nothing to do with sitting with an incense stick burning in front of you. if one keeps in the Buddha mind without straying, there's no further satori to seek. Whether awake or asleep, one is a living Buddha. Zazen means only one thing, sitting tranquilly in the Buddha mind. But really, you know, one's everyday life in its entirety should be thought of as a kind of sitting in Zen. Even during one's formal sitting, one may leave one's seat to attend to something. In my temple,
Am I on
such things are
Windows?
allowed.
Yeah, this is
Indeed, it's
Windows.
sometimes advisable to walk in Zen for one incense sticks burning and sit in Zen for the other. A natural thing after all. One can't sleep all day, so one rises. One can't talk all day, so one sits in Zen. There are no binding rules here. And so that's what happened, you see. Bankei was the abbot of Myoshinji, the Roshi. And he stopped the monks using the kaiseki stick to hit them when they weren't meditating or sleeping in meditation, because he said, even a sleeping man is still a Buddha. And you shouldn't be disrespectful. And he attempted a Zen of no methods. You can meditate if you want to, that's fine. But that's like polishing a brick to make a mirror. And he used to say, too, that trying to purify your mind is like trying to wash off blood with blood. But Bankei Zen was elusive. Hakuin had 8 successors. Bankei had none. And some people think that that was the most admirable thing about him.
Let's finish this gesture. I think this is the one I didn't like.
If I say that
Yeah, I didn't like that one. Because the music didn't match it. There we go. Oh, she was talking about Star Wars online.
I consider that I myself am a successful man in business. I hate business. I hate everything to do with it. Accounting, figuring, adding up numbers, because they're all arid. They don't smell of anything. Sometimes there's an interesting smell to the ink on a checkbook. But by and large, all this figuring is a completely colorless occupation. I don't like it. So I have to hand it over to accountants and lawyers and the people who seem to like it. But I don't know whether they really do. The essential principle of business, of occupation in the world is this. Figure out some way in which you get paid for playing.
Yeah, it does suck.
When I was quite young, I forget the exact age, I made a solemn vow, which was that I would never accept a job. I would always be my own employer. And curiously, there are very few roles in life which provide this possibility.
They might. Very possible.
The successful artist, writer, and sometimes musician, sometimes the independent consultant, can occupy this role. I mean, he may be a scientific consultant. But by and large, almost everybody seems to be compelled to take a job with a corporation. It's very difficult indeed these days to run a small business where you're your own boss, because you have to employ an enormous staff of people to keep track of the paperwork. I know a person, for example, who has a farm where he raises avocados. And the Department of Commerce visited him with a stack of forms this thick, which he had to fill in. Well, he got tough and said, I haven't the faintest idea what to fill into these forms. And he said to the agent of the Department of Commerce, you fill them in. And he made that man sit down and go through the whole procedure of filling in these forms. Because he said, I don't have the time. I'm raising avocados. That's my business. And as to all this paperwork, well, to hell with it. And the same situation prevails not only in business, but also in the university.
Bye, Pointless. And you found a mountain goat spot?
One of my
There you go.
favorite doctors told me the other day that he spends only 1/3 of his working hours practicing medicine. The rest is in recording, accounting, filling in reports. And it's the same in every hospital. Paperwork endlessly, because the record of what you do is more important than what you do. Write it down, and then it's real. And so for the same reason, a lot of people don't believe they exist until they see their activities reported in the newspaper. A lot of juvenile delinquents commit crimes just to get attention. They'll get recorded. It's like you go to a party, you know, it's a picnic on the beach, and it's great fun. And somebody says, what a shame it is that nobody has a camera. Well, now, I should talk, because at this moment, we are recording what's going on, both on tape record and on TV. And remember that it takes as long to view it or to listen to it as it does to do it. And who's going to listen to all this over and over again? So there's something fundamentally wrong here, and which the businessman of all people needs to understand. What the businessman needs to know, equally, what the army officer needs to know, is the same. What do you really want? I have proposed that there be an entirely new kind of college entrance examination, in which instead of answering a lot of silly questions, you write for about 20 pages on your idea of paradise. It can be any kind of paradise you want.
Oops.
It can be very spiritual, it can be very sensuous. But spell it out. What do you want to happen in life? And then you will hand this thesis in to an assigned tutor on the faculty. And he'll read it over and examine you closely as to whether this is what you really want. Do you realize, for example, what goes with the things you say you desire? I mean, for example, you want to marry a certain kind of beautiful woman, and you specify in your paper the characteristics she should have. But, says the tutor, you said absolutely nothing about her mother. Because every girl goes with a mother. I mean, unless she's an orphan. And you must also specify what kind of mother-in-law you want. Well, then you have to stop and think about that. And that's just an illustration of going into detail and being very careful about what you desire, because there's a good saying, be careful of what you desire. You may get it. So this is the problem of thinking out carefully where it is that you want to go. Now let's take the war in Vietnam, which is supposed to be concluded. What on earth was it all about? If we had gone with military pomp and might into Vietnam for the express purpose of conquering the country and possessing it and carrying off the women into captivity, it would have been understandable. But as it was waged for some absolutely abstract end, namely the stoppage of an ideology called communism. Nobody knows what communism is, nor do we know what capitalism is. But we can fight endlessly on the supposition that there are good guys and bad guys. And when we fight on that supposition, there is no possibility of compromise or of gentleman's agreement, as there is honor among thieves. We're all thieves, let's face it. There is a doctrine in the Jewish religion that when God created Adam, he put into him a spirit which is called the Yetzer Hara, and that means the wayward spirit, or what I call the element of irreducible rascality. And that is in us all. A little bit. It's not the whole of us. It's like just a pinch of salt in the stew. And you don't want the whole stew to be salt. But you have to have just a touch of rascality to be good. And I find it difficult to get along with people who don't know that they have it. People who come on that they're all sincere, all good, all pure, bore me to death and scare me. As they're unconscious of themselves, and therefore they suddenly do terrible things without warning, either to themselves or to others. They make promises that they're never going to fulfill because they want to talk right. And so, if I do business with someone who is not really aware that he's a rascal, I know he's impossible to do business with.
How long have I been drawing?
He'll suddenly
I would
cheat
say
me
off and on for 9 years.
But if
Seriously.
I'm aware that he's a bit
Since
of a
we all
shyster,
doodle when we're children.
I feel comfortable. And I
Right?
let him know that I am too. Then we're human. Then we can let our hair down. Then we can say, look, let's work this out. And this is what I want. And I know what you want. And if we can get that clear, we can work out a reasonable agreement. We can compromise. We have a little play of give and take. But if you don't have that, you're absolutely snarled. Now look at it this way. You can't operate business nowadays without a whole team of lawyers. And what is the function of lawyers? They're to write down the rules of the game so that we have what is called the rule of law. A lot of people talk today about law and order and how it's got to be upheld. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that all organizations, business corporations, bureaucratic government corporations,
Right.
even churches, are going by the book.
Let's see here.
They
So
are
we've done a whole
operating
bunch.
according to a manual. And in many corporations, individuals have constantly to consult some sort of manual to know what they should do, instead of using their own good sense. This doesn't work. It means
So I did a bunch from reference. Now it's time to try from my imagination. Nope, and I think Google Chrome just crashed. Yep. Good thing I have the chat box popped out. Let's see here. because all that before was all referenced and therefore didn't actually teach me a lot. I was studying. And now it's time to study how much I absorbed. For me, it's kind of like studying a portion of a math book, and then this would be like doing practice questions. Mm. Today, I don't think Jasmine plans on it. You could ask her. I think she should still be streaming until 1 o'clock. Our designated Star Wars stream day is tomorrow. But I don't know if she plans on playing outside of that. Yeah, I think our designated stream days, I'm sorry, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I can check our Trello really quick. Yeah, Tuesdays and Thursdays is our designated Star Wars days for the stream. I don't know if she plans on playing like recreationally.
Means that an organization is entirely different from an organism. You, each one of you, are an organism. A very, very complicated organism, which your nervous system facilitates, let's use that nasty word. And you don't know how you do it. You couldn't begin to describe how your nervous system works. And even neurologists don't know how it works. And yet it works reasonably well. Because your brain can handle an unknown number of variables. A variable is any identifiable process, such as breathing, such as the circulation of the blood, such as the secretions of the glands, such as the digestive system, and so on and so on. Now, you operate those all day without knowing how you do it. There's no book of rules according to which you do this. So in the same way, if a corporation is to be a true organism as distinct from an organization, it must be based on the principle of mutual trust and not on law. Because if you can't trust other people, you cannot have a community, not even a corporation. It's risky, very risky to trust other people, because they may let you down. But on the whole, if you do trust them, the chances are perhaps, 60 to 40, maybe a little more, maybe 75 to 25, that the system will work, simply because they're trusted. And as soon as you've got a system where, for example, in a supermarket, there are mirrors all over the place, TV cameras watching everything, all kinds of checks on the cashiers that they won't sneak off with something. You've got a system that increasingly won't work, because nobody will want to work there. One of the major reasons for hippies and dropouts is that human beings don't want to work under conditions like that, because they are mechanical conditions. And the mechanism is quite distinct from the organs, because the mechanism is arranged on linear plans, the book, whereas the organism transcends that. We don't know how. That means we can't write down how, because it's more complicated than any form of writing can express. Now, the computer speeds up linear calculation to a terrific extent, but it still comes nowhere near the capacity of the human brain. And so this is something that has to be recognized as a principle. Now let me give another illustration. Every corporation employs a number of people in research. Let's take IBM. They have a huge center down near San Jose where they have a research staff. And one of the first things they had to recognize is that you can't put creative research people under the clock. You've got to trust creative research people to fool around, to sit about, drink coffee or maybe whiskey, and scratch their heads and look at blackboards and play. And then suddenly, zingo, some interesting result will occur. But if you make them punch clocks, and if you say these are the things that you've got to discover, it won't work. So the corporation has to make an act of faith in its research personnel. It has to say, we recognize you have an amazing gift called brains. We don't know what these are, but it seems that in the past you've been fruitful. And so we're going to employ you to do your thing, whatever that happens to be. And we'll make an act of faith in it. And invariably, if they make that act of faith, it will work. Some fantastic idea will come out. Not perhaps the idea you expected. In fact, it may not even apply to your particular business. But you could always sell it to somebody else. Now then, let me go. This is a fundamental principle. There cannot be community, there cannot be cooperation, and therefore there cannot be commerce, which really, broken down, means being merciful to each other. There cannot be commerce without mutual trust. I mean, there are even insurance companies called Mutual Trust. But it just can't happen. The society at the moment is mutual mistrust. And therefore it becomes increasingly difficult to do anything. Business is inhibited by the lack of free enterprise. Well, that sounds very right-wing. But actually fascist states, corporate states, totalitarian states are utterly against free enterprise. So let's push this a little further. St. Paul said that the laborer is worthy of his hire. And I, as a philosopher, mere philosopher, dealing in higher things, always insist that I be paid for my work. And I get the highest fee I can get. And people say, well, you're just out for money. I say, that's none of your business. Because I give most of it away. My own needs being extremely simple. Although I enjoy good food, I don't even own a television set. And, it's a very simple life, but I've got enough. And enough is as good as a feast. You see, a lot of people don't feel happy unless they have another thing beyond money, which is called status. And status, to a very large extent in our economy, consists in conspicuous consumption. In having this thing and that thing and the other thing, in having a swimming pool, a Ferrari, a certain kind of clothes, and a certain kind of house with an enormous round-style picture window, and so on and so on and so on. And we think we need all that because we've been persuaded by a certain kind of propaganda that that's how we ought to live. Because we haven't asked ourselves whether that was what we really wanted. In other words, we've been propagandized into thinking what we wanted. I remember my daughter when she was in high school, number one daughter, who's now become very sensible, insisted that she had to have a certain number of cashmere sweaters. In those days, I couldn't afford them. I said, my dear, do you really want these? Or is it just that you've been reading ads in the magazine or listening to the other children? Because you see, schools are places where you send your child to be brought up by other children. Therefore, they get a kind of lowest common denominator of culture.
Hey, Taco, what's up?
So they all think they got to have this, they got to have that, and they don't really want it. If they sat back and considered, do I need all that? Is this trip really necessary? They would come to the conclusion that it wasn't. And that would be very important because they would save energy. You all know, of course, that we are nearing an energy crisis. That there is not enough physical energy going to be available for all the things we think we're supposed to do. Go rushing around and so on. So we need to take towards commerce a more relaxed attitude.
Yesterday afternoon, I was discussing the plausibility of two essential features of the philosophy of illusion. The question that we have to decide whether to take life seriously or not. That is to say, whether the plot is comic or tragic. And if it's tragic,
feel free to borrow what you will. All of mine are borrowed.
Tragic.
I borrow them from every source I find.
And the question of who are you? And are we to say that I myself, right down at
people
root,
drawing is hard.
I'm just a little
I'm still like
jerk
figuring it out myself. That's why I'm
really
studying.
Has nothing to do with this cosmos, but just arises in it.
They're very, very
And is
hard
here on
because
sufferance
there's a
for
lot
short
going
period,
on.
and then
Lots of
absolutely
relationships.
nothing follows, you see. Or the alternative to that is what I really am, the same as the whole thing. That is, the works, the it, or whatever you want to call it. Brahman, God, the Tao, the great void, the Buddha nature, I don't care, the self, anything, any name you want. And
I missed out. This is supposed to be
that attitude,
nipples. This
you
is
can look
supposed
at
to
it
be
from various
navel.
points of
This
view
is
in
supposed to be
judging it.
crotch.
You can say,
it's wishful thinking. You can say that it's insufferable pride. But the point of the matter is, as I tried to show, any other way of looking at things is kind of schizoid. It looks at human beings as if they arrived in this world like a bunch of birds on the branches of a barren tree. They just got settled there, you know, they don't belong. The sense of being strangers and pilgrims from another domain altogether. Well, where is this other domain? And how does it relate to this one? Are they separate? I showed you that even when we
Thank
say
you.
that two domains are the poles
Appreciate
apart,
that.
the very
Lots
fact that they're
and
poles
lots of
shows
work.
that they have a hidden connection. And the hidden connection
I post
is the
about
big thing in
10%
life.
of what I do.
All you junkies know that. And so,
I'm a very
in other
slow
words, we get
learner.
a pattern of organization that is radial rather than an assemblage, as if the universe were really a multiverse. A lot of things that got collected together out of the infinite wastes of space and sort of began to maunder around each other. Whereas the other pattern, which is so much more sensible, is central and radial, and I showed you how the crystals and the stars and the octopuses and even the human beings are all radial structures. Of course, we don't see our radial relationship to the totality of the universe because it isn't obvious. It's obvious that a tree is an arm of the earth reaching up and waving at the sky, and a mountain is another kind of radiation from the earth, and so is a leg from a body, and hair, and things like that.
This is going terribly.
But what makes
You figure.
human beings, as the highest of the mammals, so conscious of being independent is that they are topologically an enclosed surface, you see, which wanders around independently of the ground. What we don't notice is that we are not independent of the ground at all. That wandering around is something that is entirely related to there being some ground. In other words, when you run up a hill, the hill also runs you up it. The hill rises and lifts you as you run, you see? And if you understand that, you don't take a hostile attitude to mountains and hills. You're grateful to them for lifting you up so high in the air, because that's presumably why you went up, that the thing was high. It was lifted up. You wanted to be lifted up. It lifted you up. You had to cooperate, of course. I always like the illustration that I've used before, perhaps you haven't heard it, of the thistledown. The thistledown, too, comes moving through the sky. I once was playing with the thing, you know, and just came out of the blue sky, and it caught it like that, pulled it under my nose, and it started to pull, to get away. See? It looks as if it were a butterfly or something that pulls away when you catch it by the leg. And I thought, oh no, of course, that's not the thistledown, it's the wind. Well, which was it? You know, in a famous debate that was settled by the sixth patriarch of Zen, there were two monks arguing when a flag was flapping in the wind, whether it was the wind or the flag that was moving. And he said, it's neither, it's the mind. And so in a way, the same thing was true about the thistledown. The mind is the moving thing, because which point of view will you take? Which attitude of mind will you take towards this? Is it the wind moving the thistledown? Or is it the thistledown that is moving itself with the wind? After all, when you see a sailing boat, and there's a man in the sailing boat, who is moving the boat? Is it the wind moving the boat? Or is it the man moving the boat because he was smart enough to put up a sail? Much smarter way of getting around than rowing. You don't have to work. It's intelligence, you see, the mind that moves the boat. And so in the same way, I thought, you know, this thistledown has some kind of intelligence. It's radial, it's organized, it's beautiful. And it's used that to sail itself with the wind, to enable itself to pull like a little organism playing with the wind. And so in just the same way, each one of us uses the universe to get around, and the universe uses us to play with and to make games and patterns and to do its stuff. So because we seem to be disconnected and entirely sealed within our skin, that is a very deceptive thing, because the skin is not really the boundary of man. You'll notice that in various periods of art, human beings have been shaped in different ways. And have been more or less transparent at some times, at other times opaque, and sometimes the emphasis has been on the state of mind which this human being is in. At other times the emphasis is on the bodily conformations and so on. In the work of painters today, one sees images that at first sight one doesn't recognize as being human. There was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York some years ago called The New Image of Man. And these things didn't look like human beings at all. Some of them did, but that's because what does a human being look like? That depends on your point of view. You see, if you are prejudiced that a human being is only what is inside his skin, then you think that when anybody paints the human being beyond those boundaries, that he's lost the image of man. He hasn't necessarily lost it at all. You see, there's an old feeling that the shape of the universe is the shape of man. I don't know if you've ever heard that said. That man is the microcosm, and that the universe as a whole is the macrocosm. Now, as you plumb out into the universe and explore it astronomically, it gets very strange. You begin to see things in the depths that at first sight seem utterly remote. How could they have anything to do with us? They are so far off and so unlikely. And in the same way, when you start probing into the inner workings of the human body, you come across all kinds of funny little monsters and wiggly things that bear no resemblance to what we recognize as the human image. Look at a spermatozoon under a microscope, that little tadpole. And how can that have any connection with a grown human being? It's so unlike, you see. It's foreign feeling. And you get the creeps sometimes, the foreign feeling about yourself, if you feel your own pulse. Or if you're able to look at an X-ray in some way of your inner organs working. See, they're all strangers to us. We don't know about them. And they give us the creeps, as if they were, coming across some weird insects in the dark. That sort of feeling. But what we will always find out in the end, you see, when we meet the very strange thing, and we look into the distant reaches of space, there will one day be the dawning recognition. That's me. Why, that's me. And the whole game of the universe, you see, is to appear as strange to itself as it possibly can. That's how one keeps variety going. That's how one keeps wonder going, and all kinds of exciting developments. How different can you get? In the beginning, the Lord said, get lost, to himself, see. So, we shall find, for example, that space that you see all around you and containing you. And you can feel space in many ways. Space is not only something that comes through the eyes. The movement of your arms, if with closed eyes, if for a blind person, is his way of knowing space. And you can hear space audibly. Lots of sounds appear to be in restricted spaces or ample spaces.
Oh.
And silence that goes with sound corresponds to space.
All right.
And even St. Thomas
It's the
Aquinas, that
halfway
old Catholic
point.
theologian, said that good derives its virtue
Gonna
from
take a
evil,
really quick
just
break.
as it is the silent pause that gives sweetness to the chant.
Oops.
So, but space, you see, that seems to contain.
Oh, forgot to save.
Space is one's mind.
There we go.
This was common sense to people living in the early Renaissance, for example, at the time of Dante. There are many references in Dante's poetry to the identity of mind and space. And likewise in a 8th century text in China, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, he likens the nature of mind to the nature of space. He says just as space contains all the sun and the moon and the stars and the people and the mountains and the forests, so the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness, the nature of oneself contains all these things. So you see that if you think that way, you have an image of man that is global, that is very different from the image in which man is defined as bounded by his skin. That's a prejudice. We think now, for example, I have my own private thoughts. Well, nobody has private thoughts. Because one thinks in images and words, and these words and images are derived from the whole thought structure of the society in which you live. We think thoughts. The domain of mind is very similar to the grid structure of an electric power supply system. You know, what happens is there's a network of power stations and transformers so arranged that if one of them gives out and fails to supply a certain area, immediately the grid connects them with other sources of power. Well, in rather a similar way, our minds are connected. Let's take one very obvious example of it. What Northrop Frye calls the order of words. The order of words is all existing literature, both rhetoric, what is spoken, of course, and what is written down. Now, it's his theory that as a scholar of literature and the history of literature, he can take any piece of writing of a reasonable length and tell you when it was written. Because everything that is written and said is inescapably related to the whole order of words. And it's amazing what little things you might not notice would give you away. Because he can say, well, obviously he has read this, thinking, say, of a particular novelist or poet. So it must come after the date when that novel was published. But he couldn't possibly use an expression like that to say, for example, that it was a capital day. He would never use that expression living, say, in contemporary 20th century America. That's a Victorianism, or it's an Edwardian way of talking. And so by all sorts of little clues like that, the scholar can pin down a piece of writing to when it was written, you see? That is because every individual piece of writing is a function of all writing that's being done. Well, now that's a very specific and almost crude illustration of something that's going on in a far more complicated way than that. It isn't only all writing, all thinking is being done in relation to the total order of thought. And in a still more subtle way, all living is being done in relation to the total order of life, to what de Chardin calls the biosphere, and it goes way beyond that, because of the vast interplay of what we now call gravitational and electrical fields, which embrace everything that there is. That is why the ancients when a person was born, cast his horoscope. That was a map of the universe at the time of that person's birth. And therefore it was a drawing of his soul. Because the soul is not inside the body. The body is inside the soul. The soul, your soul, is the whole universe as it is focused upon your organism. Now, of course, astrology is a very primitive science, and it interpreted the influence of the universe upon the individual in very crude ways, and it works mostly by good guesswork on the part of the astrologer. If you know how to tell fortunes at a fair, you will find out a great deal about how all these predictive psychic sciences work, because the client invariably gives himself away. Either by his anxiety to be told the truth or by his anxiety to conceal it. They work equally well. Now, but there is, you see, underneath the astrological notion, a sound idea that the true map of the soul is the picture of the universe surrounding the individual. It isn't necessarily your soul is not the picture of the universe just at the moment when you were born, you see. It goes along all the time you live, because the whole thing expresses itself through you. And therefore, in that sense, the map of the stars, the horoscope, etc., was an image of man in just the same way as we regard a picture of the human body as an image of man. And it's an image from a different point of view. It's a bigger image. It shows, in other words, that your mind is very largely outside your body. After all, it's inside too, it's simultaneous. You see, I cannot think, I can't have a mind without seeing, feeling, and relating to other people. Without all the social institutions, not only language, but the laws, the customs, the gestures, the rituals by which we relate to each other. All those things compose the mind. For the mind is a huge network of relationships and interconnections at a high level of sensitivity. Mind and matter are, of course, polar. They go together. They are two ways of thinking about the same thing, or shall we say two dimensions of the same thing, just like length and breadth, or just, shall we say, like shape and color. You see, nobody ever saw a shape that wasn't colored. Nobody ever saw a color that wasn't shaped. And yet we can see there's a very clear difference between color and shape. But they always go together, they're always found together. Well, it's the same sort of relationship between mind and matter. And the difficulty that people have in trying to reduce one to the other and saying, well, the world is only material, or saying, on the other hand, that it's only mental, is the same difference you would have in trying to reduce all shapes to colors or all colors to shapes. Shape and color are made for each other, like a marriage made in heaven. They go together so perfectly and yet stay so marvelously different. That's why the Buddhists say, difference is identity. Identity is difference. It sounds goofy, but it makes a great deal of sense, because what it's saying is a relational thing, that you don't know what identity is unless you know what difference is, and you don't know what difference is unless you know what identity is. That relationship between so-called opposites is called in the Chinese technical Taoist vocabulary mutual arising. So they say to be and not to be arise mutually. High and low are mutually posited. Long and short are mutually delineated, and so on. Now, what we see then is the totality of the cosmos focused at each point, you see, gives rise to the illusion of the independence of the point from the whole. Just as the human being, by virtue of having an enclosed epidermis, and to be able to walk instead of having to be rooted to the ground, presents the illusion of being separate. And so that's why I asked Vada to do these demonstrations last night, because he showed visually the interdependence of the figure and the background, and how the two play together, how you can switch from paying attention to one to paying attention to the other, and in each case it's significant. That is an art that we have lost in our day-to-day perception of life, and it leads, practically speaking, to the serious problem of ecological blindness. That is to say, to the ignorance which most human beings seem to suffer from, especially in our culture, that they are inseparably related to their physical environment. It looks as if we aren't. It looks as if we can go out with bulldozers and insecticides and every kind of a gadget and make over our physical environment as it suits our whims. But then we discover to our consternation that we've
not on
upset
mute.
all sorts of balances.
Got some new
That
reference.
the house we made such a nice flat lot
This
for
one's
on
going
the
to be a
hillside
stylized
suddenly
reference
it
instead of
slides
a
down
life
the hill when there's a
reference.
rainstorm, because we took away all the shrubbery that was binding the hill together. And you know, this happens in Hollywood every day. And and nobody ever seems to learn. And that's, you see, this immense importance of overcoming
I think this is
the
a
illusion
Shazam
of
comic.
separate.
Yeah.
But people are afraid of that because they think it's communistic. They think that the grand style, the great thing about Western civilization is its stress on individual personality and its value. And that we have created the ideal of personal integrity. That is to say that the most important thing in the world is the individual. All collectivities, corporations, states, and so on, exist as servants of the individual. And if they get in his way and they interfere with his private enterprise, whatever that may be, it's a bad thing. Man, the individual, is the crown of creation from this point of view. And therefore, when anybody suggests that individual man is not what you thought was an individual, but is in some way united with, grounded in the totality, then if you're this kind of rugged individualist, you mix up your vocabulary and you call the totality the collective. Now, the collective and the totality are two completely different things. The idea of collectivism is based on individualism. It's the idea that the society of mankind and the physical environment beyond it is a collection with nothing of the kind. That's the idea of cosmic flotsam and jetsam that all floated together into a collection. And that's the obverse of individualism. You know, American individualism is the same philosophy as Marxist collectivism, seen from the other side, because they're both based on the same erroneous sensation of individuality. Now, what people don't understand is that a complex and interesting personality is not a matter of being isolated. It's a matter of being deeply connected with and aware of one's relationship to the whole surrounding cosmos. let's suppose that I'm preparing to make a date with some lady, and she's such an individualist that her thoughts are only occupied with herself. She never thinks about anything that isn't herself. Well, she's an awful bore. She has nothing to say. She's not interested in any books, in any landscapes, in any works of art, in any literature, in any other people. She's a total bore. But the more, on the other hand, she would be interested in all those things that are supposed to be not herself, the more of a colorful personality she becomes. So the rule is to get away, you see, from these ideas of the individual as finding his individuality and uniqueness through independence, but rather finding his individuality and uniqueness through being related. Because you see, that's what makes us look at the word relation from another point of view when we talk about our friends and relations. Supposing I come across some individual who I can't make out what kind of a thing he is. I can't make out where he came from. His accent isn't American, it isn't British. It isn't particularly Middle Western, it certainly doesn't have the overtones of New York or New England. He just talks flat. And as to his style of clothing, it's utterly nondescript. Well, I think this is pretty much of a bore. What I like to see in an individuality, in a physical individual, is ways that I can relate him to his ancestry. That he has this little subtle accent, or this mannerism, or this eccentricity, or whatever it is that connects him with a great background, you see? But it's his connection with his background that makes him so significant. If I can't see that connection, he becomes uninteresting. So there is no thought in this approach to devalue the individual. What really does devalue the individual is any kind of religious or political philosophy that overstresses his isolation. And this is something that Californians in particular need to take note of. And because many people feel, you see, that the development of technology and of centralized government is a direct threat to the value of personality. Well, in some ways it is. But that is only because technology is being developed by personalities who don't understand what personality is. They're working on the old individualist - collectivist point of view. They're the same.
You're overpowered by anatomy.
So then, you see, this is
well,
the illusion.
I'm being overpowered by fact, and I am
That
losing
the
a
individual
war.
is operating all by himself. That actions and thoughts and deeds proceed solely from inside his skin, so that we can say, there's where it started. You see? Well, that's the game of praising and blaming. The game of who started it, who can we give candy to, who can we bang on the head. In other words, somebody has to be it. As in The Farmer in the Dell, you know, and finally you get the end, the cheese stands alone, the cheese stands alone. Hi, over there, the cheese stands alone. So why?
Humidity.
Who started it? The group.
Indeed.
Well, another fear about this is that it absolves people of responsibility if they see through the illusion of separateness. The truth of the matter is, actually, that no philosophy of history has really succeeded in making anybody more or less responsible. In other words, let's say that you are a Christian, a Catholic, of the old-fashioned medieval type, who believes that you've got an individual soul with free will and that you're under responsibility to God to obey his law, and that if you don't, the most disastrous consequences imaginable will befall you. You will fry in hell forever. There's no evidence whatsoever that believing in that made people any more virtuous than they are today. None at all. Indeed, clergy who believed in all this owned whorehouses and all kinds of things. They were just as contemptuous of law and order as anybody could be now. And part of the reason was, of course, that the threat of hell was an unimaginable penalty like the H-bomb. It's just too big to think about, and really brings justice into disrespect because it uses such crude and clumsy methods. You know, it's like using a steam hammer to drive in tacks. Responsibility is a thing like a nice face, which you either have or haven't. Certain backgrounds, certain interests, certain awarenesses of relationship create responsibility in some human beings. And they live that way not because they are giving themselves sermons and telling themselves all the time that they ought to be responsible. It's because they're intelligent enough to see that being responsible makes things very much easier for everybody all around. That's all there is to it.
This one's like blah.
And of course that's all, it's a big all. But you won't, what I'm saying is, the people who are frightened that other people will abandon responsibility never did have any way of thinking that would guarantee that people would be responsible. There is no such guarantee. If there were, we should be automata. Now, I want to switch to another aspect of illusion. The quickness of the hand deceives the eye. And that is, of course, the great illusion of what we call matter. Density, impenetrability, opacity. I find it hard to talk about the illusion of matter because I'm a materialist. That is to say, I like materials. And though I may seem to you to be quite self-contradictory. For example, a wine should have body. Pure alcohol doesn't. And it's terribly important in human character for there to be a blend of materialism and mysticism, between sensuality and spirituality. You see, people who are purely sensuous and materialistic get very boring. You can fill your lives with all good things, with Alfa Romeos and hi-fis and wonderful cameras and girls with beautiful bodies and Chris Crafts and dry martinis and Chanel No. 5, you know. And after a while, if that's all you've got, it gets sickening and the bottoms begin to feel like plastic and the martinis taste like medicine. And somehow, bleh, you get a distaste for life, and even for mountains and trees and waters. And then on the other hand, the purely spiritual approach to things is too rarefied, too earnest, too abstract, too purely Euclidean. And the people who are intensely spiritual and don't have any sensuality are always desperately serious, colorless, lacking in humor, and never are able to meet one as man to man with a kind of a friendly leer in the eye. That's terribly important. Oh, yes, they live at a level of frantic intensity. I see these two extremes need each other. Say, spirituality needs a beer and a loud burp, and sensuality needs a rough blanket and a hard bed and a cold night with the stars, to wonder about. The sensualist as such, the materialist as such, has no wonder, and the mystic, the pure mystic, has no body. He's pure alcohol. Spirit. So, if then one should say that material is an illusion, this seems to be selling out to the spirit people and to the mystics. And so Christian scientists are, generally speaking, as personalities, totally lacking in materialism. They're prissy and lacking in color, and their churches are very, very disagreeable. They're all reading desks, and they're too bookish, and they have no ritual, no ceremonies, no verve, you see? It's all cerebral. And likewise, when people get the wrong idea about Hinduism or Buddhism, they go into this same ultra-mysticism. They start disbelieving in all material pleasures as crutches. And it's very bad to have crutches, you see. You shouldn't take aspirin when you've got a headache. You shouldn't wear glasses. You shouldn't show dependence on anything. You mustn't like your food too much, because that's becoming gluttonous. So you eat very plain food, which is not spiced, and you eat it out of a sense of duty. That is to keep the body functioning. You drink only water, because other drinks might cause you dependence and give you too much pleasure. And because the idea is, you see, you've got to control your mind and keep it absolutely calm and still, so that you are not dependent on matter. And that's altogether the wrong approach, because, it is a game you can play. It is one of these possible things. I mean, you can play the Jehovah's Witness game. You can play the three-seed and the Spirit Baptist game. All these are various things which you can play, just as you can take up a hobby for bridge or fishing or something like that. But what happens is, you see, that the notion that the material world is an illusion is turned into a judgment of value. If it's an illusion, therefore it's bad. I ought not to be under this illusion. Well, the reality of the matter is that if you see that the material world is an illusion, you can enjoy it a great deal better than if you think it isn't. A true materialist, therefore, is one who knows that material is an illusion.
Ding.
Then he's not afraid of it. Then he can enter into the dance of material with real zest.
This is so hard.
You see, if you're a false and a fake material,
It is hard. It's hard for me. That's why I have to distract myself with Alan Watts' philosophy from the 40s.
ranch style with a picture
Just can't
window,
concentrate too
patio and a
much.
swimming pool, and
Later,
you've got,
Taco.
a lot of stock, and you somehow
That's
wangle
the key.
the money
Don't
and borrow it.
concentrate too
Keep lying
much.
awake nights wondering if you're going to make the payments. Well, there's no point in that at all. How can you possibly enjoy all this jazz? If that's the kind of jazz you want to enjoy, you've got to worry about whether you pay for it or not. And you get hopelessly involved, you get commitments here, commitments there, and finally you have a nervous breakdown and shoot yourself. The only way to enjoy material is to disbelieve in it, just as one can disbelieve in money. Then you can have zest for it, you see? Otherwise, it's much better to be poor. I mean, if you have no taste for this kind of life and no real interest in it, but feel that somehow you ought to have it for status reasons, it's much better to stay poor. Not have any of that stuff at all. So, then this is the important thing I'm trying to say. Material is an illusion, but a great illusion. And the point is to swing it, and not to run away from it on the one hand, or to get stuck on it in the other. Then you can play with it. Just like a wheel going round. If the wheel is too loose on the axle, it wobbles all over the place. If it's too tight, it won't revolve. But you kind of sit loose, you see, to this thing. Not too loose, though. Now, in what way, then, is the material world an illusion? Well, we know a lot about this now from our physics. And we know that what we call solidity is force, contained force. The agitation of particles or wavicles or whatever they are at such an immense speed that they become impenetrable to other agitations. So that when I put my foot on the floor, the reason it doesn't go through the floor is that the floor is coming into existence and going out of existence so rapidly that there is no interval through which my foot can penetrate. Like an airplane propeller, you can't put your head through it without getting it chopped off. Only that if it were going far faster still, it wouldn't even cut your head off. It would just be like banging your head against a brick wall. And it has to be going fast too within an extraordinarily small and restricted space. The airplane propeller is whizzing around through a considerable space in relation to the size of the head. But if it were going much faster, but through much smaller spaces, you see, then it would be like banging your head against a brick wall. So what we've got in our so-called physical objective world is a behavior of energy where matter arises from it through its behavior in restricted spaces. Density is a quality of space rather than a quality of matter. You see what I mean? I gave the illustration of the airplane propeller to try and show that. So that all this is an electronic, diaphanous world, very similar to other creations of electronic patterns, the dance of forms on the TV screen, the rainbow, the aurora borealis. It's all fundamentally like that. Only we are of the same kind of jazz, you see. Our bodies are this dance too. And therefore, the physical world feels real to us. In other words, it feels solid because we're something of the same kind. If we were on a different wavelength, we'd walk right through it. In the same way as radio waves come right through the house. They are of such a nature that they can penetrate the spaces, the interstices, or in some way jazz signals through. And we are on the same wavelength, you see, as the wall, and so don't go through it. But nevertheless, the whole cosmos is therefore a function of energy, or you could say of light, something like light, and therefore we and it are all diaphanous. Now, it's easier to see that if you live in a medium where things aren't so dense. There's only one other creature as intelligent as man And this lives in a medium that is less dense. And this is the dolphin. The dolphin is a mammal. And many millions of years ago, it seems that dolphins were living on the land. But they are very clever. And they decided that the land was no place to live. Because getting food was difficult, and you had to lug yourself around, and there were many, many bad shows about the land. It had very curious changes of temperature. It became unspeakably cold and unspeakably hot, and you had, in fact, to work. Well, no sensible person ever works. I never work, I get paid for playing. And everybody should do that. That's the mark of an educated man, is that eventually he gets a job where he's paid for playing. And a worker or a proletarian isn't necessarily a poor man. There are lots of poor, a poor man like, say, Selig Morgenrath or Eric Barker around here, they're not proletarians. Proletarian is a person who is fettered to the process of work. That is to say, to doing chores every day that he really doesn't like and that aren't in the least interesting in order to go on living. So the dolphins decided this is ridiculous, this land existence, and they went back to the water. And it's pretty easy to fish, you see. There are plenty of fish in the water and things to eat. Because we know the ocean is the greatest food supply in the world. And when they'd eaten a few fish or whatever they need, they decided just to have a ball. So the dolphin can get abreast of a ship, get one of the wakes coming out on the side, can set its tail at an angle of 26 degrees, you know, and be pushed along by the ship. And it's not going anywhere. There's no reason to go along there. You know, as if it had to get to another part of the sea's pretty much the same all through. But they're just going whoop, whee, boom, and they chatter and dance, and they're really highly civilized beings. And so, please don't anybody ever kill dolphins or be unkind to dolphins, because they're exemplary, high-minded creatures. And we shall soon discover this. As soon as we can set up communication with them, they will tell us all about it, and we will then invent a new style of civilization based on frolic. But you see, they dance in the mode of water. Now, human beings, as Toynbee has pointed out, as their civilization progresses, they begin to lose their roots. And they are less and less tied to the land. They go into the air.
Bah!
What's gonna
That's how I
happen,
feel right now.
As if man develops without blowing himself
My
up
brain
to
is
bits
on fire.
and get over the hurdles,
So.
the dangerous point, is that gradually all roads are going to disappear. And the earth will have centers of human habitation, you see, but no roads. They'll be as
I like
obsolete
this
as no
one.
roads,
This one's okay.
because everybody will fly. And once the medium of air is much more fluid than the medium of water.
So I'm going to post a sketch
And as
dump
we fly,
on
you see,
DeviantArt,
on the land,
and I'm going to take a break. Got work tonight. May stream later. I feel like I need more than sleep. I probably need breakfast. So, yeah. Here's where I'm going to end my stream. It's a little bit early, but I'm sure you guys, uber fascinated, will forgive me. If I do not pick it up later on tonight, well, actually, no, I have my little sister's award ceremony. She's graduating tonight. So, yes, I will see you all tomorrow. All the sketches today, I'm gonna shrink them and stuff them all into the same, like, page and put them on DeviantArt. And, yeah. So, I'll see you guys tomorrow.